Hey, this is Vu, and this is my definitive guide to improving. So this is everything you wanted to know or potentially didn't want to know about improving at CS and becoming a better CS player. And if you like the content, feel free to subscribe, or if you really like it, you can hit me up on Patreon with the link in the description. But anyways, the first thing we'll go into here is aim, because this is obviously the hot topic that everybody wants to look at when they're trying to improve at CS. And importantly, when you really boil CS down to it, a lot of what you're trying to do by using utility, by trying to outsmart people, is you're trying to make your opponent's shots as hard to hit as possible and your shots as easy to hit as possible so you can try and win the round in that way. A lot of the time, that's what CS really boils down to. Now, the reality is when you really think about aiming at its base, it really is just how fast you can point and click on people. It's really very heavily based on your muscle memory and on your hand-eye coordination, of course. But when people complain about their aim and think they have bad aim, it's actually very often relative to their time to kill. And that means when a player enters your screen, how fast do you kill them? How long does it take you to get that frag? And of course, it also relies on them not killing you before you kill them. So it relies on you potentially positioning so you die slower, because if they kill you in 0.1 second, it doesn't matter if you would have killed them theoretically in 0.2 seconds. Now, there's a lot that goes into that, and point-click aim is one of the factors, but the other factors to me are much more important, and this is where people oftentimes get a little bit lost. They spend too much time deathmatching and not enough time working on the other factors. Now, the first two things, and probably the most important ones in my eyes, especially for lower level players, is going to be your crosshair placement and your movement, especially when you're playing against pugs and matchmaking, where people tend to do a very poor job of making your shots hard to hit by utilizing utility and timing and things like that. Oftentimes, if your crosshair and your movement are very in tune and on point, you're going to have a very easy time of getting frags, especially at lower levels where people constantly play very obvious angles. Now, when it comes to movement, I'm adding crosshair placement in as something that works in tandem with movement, because when you're going for peaks, let's say, for example, you're peeking out towards the boxes here, you are lining your crosshair very often up against a wall for this aggressive crosshair placement, strafing out and stopping, because you know where your crosshair will be when you strafe out to that exact moment. So your movement is very relevant and very important in relation to where you're setting up your crosshair to get these peaks off. Now, the peaks are the part that I want to go over first here. The movement is the important part. Now, there are quite a few different ways to peak, but the most relevant ones I'm going to be talking about here are the shoulder peak, the crouch peak, and the wide peak, or the wide crouch peak if you want to do a wide shoulder peak. So potentially 4, and we'll talk about the swing as well. So 5 types of peaks. Now, what most of these rely on is the idea of how you actually want to be peeking into a player, and they rely very heavily on peeker's advantage. Now, to boil it down very quickly, peeker's advantage is the idea that due to several factors, including some human things like not reacting all that quickly when you're holding an angle for a long time, and a game mechanic that means that when you peek out on someone, you're actually going to see them fractions of a second before they see you, giving you peeker's advantage for all these things combined. You want to be making sure that you're peeking into people correctly. Now, the most obvious way to do it is with the shoulder peek. And the reason movement is important here is because you are actually tapping the D button a little bit before you actually get to the angle where you're trying to stop. You have to know where you need to tap it so that you slow down at the right speed. Now, you might also be thinking, how am I supposed to peek out on these people as well? Well, I've made a little paint thing here for you. Now, if you imagine your opponent is holding the angle over here on back catwalk that I'm peeking into in game while I'm showing you, and they're holding an angle, this is their line of sight. This is where their crosshair is. The reality is that due to geometry, you want to be as far away from the corner as possible, and in order to get the best peeker's advantage possible, or at least the best advantage in general, you want to be intersecting their crosshair placement or their line of sight at a 90-degree angle. That's basically what you want to be doing. You want to be peeking, your movement is perpendicular to their line of sight. And this is something I see newer players or lower level players often get lost on, not realizing that this is what they want to be doing. So however you can get into this situation, that's how you want to be peeking into your opponents with consistency. You also, as I mentioned, want to be as far away from the close corner as possible, because for example, if someone's in this corner up here on the ledge and you peek out holding the close angle, they're going to see you here while they're still not visible on your screen, and they're going to have a long time to be able to react to you. Instead, you want to be peeking as far away as possible, so the time where they see you and you don't see them is as low as possible. Now at an angle like this, if I have an opponent at this angle here, a lot of the time you would be thinking, if you don't think about intersecting their line of sight, you're thinking that you want to slide along the back wall, because that's oftentimes how people peek out and you see them peek out. However, what you actually want to be doing at this angle specifically, because you want to intersect their line of sight, you are strafing out into the wall. And the thing that you really need your movement to be good for is to be able to stop right at the shoulder peak, but also to be able to line up how far away from the wall you want to start, so that as you get to the peak right here, you are as close to this back wall as physically possible. And it's pretty easy once you get used to it, but the first few times you do it, you're going to end up way out in the middle of the open. You just need to get some practice in. But optimally, you strafe out, stop, and I'm as close to this back wall as possible before actually hitting it, or in theory I could be hitting it just as I stop, so that the next step would be strafing into the wall, and I'm utilizing the geometry of the peak as well as possible. Now, when it comes to the shoulder peak here, you want to be shoulder peaking for the most part when you're clearing angle by angle. So generally that means when you're entering into a bomb site, you want to be shoulder peaking all of the angles one by one. Now, the crouch peak is generally a superior peak as in terms of actually shooting back at your opponent, because when you crouch as you peek, you are actually accurate as soon as you crouch, which means you can shoot a little bit quicker than you can if you were shoulder peeking. And you also have the added incentive or bonus where they might be aiming for your head and you peek out low. Why don't you want to be crouch peeking all the time? Well, the reason you don't want to constantly crouch peek is because you're exposing yourself a little bit more, where your ass sometimes sticks out and someone can see you at an off angle where you can't see them. And you're also fully committing yourself to an engagement where someone could potentially be at some sort of an off angle. And if you notice them, you can oftentimes try and reposition, or you can take a shot at a player here, see too many players and quickly jump away. But when you crouch to the angle, you are fully committed very often and you have no way of getting out of it. So the crouch peak is generally superior if you know a player is going to be at an angle, or if you're peeking out at an angle where it doesn't matter if you're fully committed and there's no real off angles nearby. And a great angle would be here at long A. Someone holding this angle here very likely has an op, which means all you're trying to do is outreact them. And crouch peeking allows you to shoot faster and utilize your peeker's advantage to a better extent. And it does not matter that you are fully committed, because all he needs to do is land a shot off on you anyways. So if you're ever peeking into an angle where an opper is likely holding, for example towards elevator here, towards long corner there, things like that, crouch peaks are very good. And they're also great in angles like this, where as you get to try and peek this angle here, you know that there's no other off angle, you've already cleared these, you can crouch peek it because you're fully committed anyways, and there's no off angle to kind of catch you off guard if your ass is showing off to the side, right? So that's when you want to be going for a crouch peek. Now, why would you go for a wide crouch peek? Of course, I've already said that you have a little bit of peeker's advantage, again, partly due to the client, a little bit due to the client, and partly due to just human interaction because someone's holding an angle. Well, oftentimes you wide peek when you've already establish that a player is in a certain location, especially if you've already established that and they know it. So for example, if you peek out and shoot at a player behind these stairs here as they're holding the angle, he's no longer going to be bored holding an angle, not sure if someone's going to be showing up. His reactions are going to be a little bit heightened, and you might feel like re-peeking into it is going to be a little bit awkward. Now, instead of re-peeking into it with a shoulder peek, as you did probably the first time, you could try one of a couple of things. You could either try the crouch peek, or you can try the wide peek. And the great thing about the wide peek is it does force this player to readjust his crosshair not only down, but also a little bit wider, and very oftentimes, especially against riflers, allows you to get the first shot or two off. And this can sometimes mean that you're able to finish off an opponent when they're in a spot where you already know they're there, and it allows you to give yourself just a couple shots maybe, or one shot before they react very often, especially against players that have slower reaction times. So the wide crouch peek, or the wide peek in general, is a little bit less common if you're trying to actually take a player down than the other two peeks I've showed, but it definitely does have its place, and if you can utilize it well, you're going to find yourself having a very good time. But the main thing you want to be making sure that you have down is the shoulder peek, and there are a couple of ways to practice this. The first and most obvious one would be the Prac maps, and these are maps where bots will be stationed throughout the map at angles like this, on the ledge here as well. On Catwalk on Dust 2 is a map where they have a Prac. They might have a player here as well, where you can go through and you can get a feel for how peeking these angles effectively feels, and how you can actually make sure you're controlling your player model throughout the peaks as you're clearing the area. Now, the other thing you can do to practice is actually KZ. KZ maps, of course, are movement-focused maps, but they're not actually the competitive maps. They're going to be maps where you're doing some weird jumps, you're doing a lot of strafing, things like that. Now, they don't actively improve your ability to peek out on this player specifically. However, what it will do is it'll give you a better understanding of your character model and how it can maneuver, how fast it moves, how fast it stops, all these sorts of things, so that you can move a little bit better and you can have a better understanding of how your character model moves throughout the map in general, which will help when it comes to peeking out on people. It's just a little bit abstract from that if you're, not really thinking about it. It also helps when you're in situations, for example, if you're holding this angle here and you get blinded, so you can jump around the corner while you're blind and you know exactly how large your character model is and how you can strafe around it in these sorts of situations. So KZ maps certainly help at least a little bit, and they're a fun way to get some movement practice rather than mind-numbingly going through the same peeking, exercise over and over, where you're just practicing one thing back to back to back. Now, when it comes to crosshair placement, of course, I've mentioned some aggressive crosshair placement, where if you're peeking into an angle and trying to shoulder peek it, oftentimes you stare at the wall, line it up, and peek out into the angle, so you just stop with your crosshair there. That's one type of aggressive crosshair placement. The other one is the tracking around the corner, the smooth tracking crosshair placement. And this is when you're trying to peek out on an angle where there could be some off angles that your opponents are holding that you want to make sure you clear out, where, you can't really tell as you're peeking out on this box here. Someone could be anywhere along this line in these angles, potentially. So you can shoulder peek here, but it would be very odd to peek out here since there could be people along this line. So instead of doing that, you swing your crosshair close around the corner as you track the ledge, making sure that if someone's there, all you have to do is stop with your crosshair already on them and shoot. And then when you get to this angle here, you can try and do something weird like a crouch peek, whatever, to try and find the kill on the player there, which is the angle you're actually trying to peek. So of course, you can try and get this type of swing crosshair placement very effective when you're going for rushes, when you're trying to clear out many angles at the same time. For example, as you head up cat, you might clear out here and then swing out here to clear these angles, where players could very often be, but they could also be on the off angles as well. Now, these are fairly basic forms of crosshair placement that should be fairly easy to get down. What's hard to get down oftentimes is the defensive crosshair placement. This is where you're holding an angle and waiting for an opponent to peek out on you, and you're trying to position your crosshair so that you can have it on their head when they peek out on you. And the natural inclination a lot of the time is to have your crosshair incredibly close to the corner, waiting for a pixel to show up so you can shoot immediately. There's actually a Launders video on this topic I'll try and link in the description, which is Launders talking about Swag and his crosshair placement. What Swag does that I try to replicate, because I think it's incredibly important to be able to realize this, is that he holds his crosshair quite far from the corner. Well, not quite far, but further than you would expect, somewhere out like here. And what that allows is it allows the player that's peeking out on him, or me, to strafe into your crosshair. It's very often that players will overpeak this super narrow angle you're trying to hold here, and they'll get past it. And if you hold your crosshair too close to the corner, that means you'll have to move your crosshair to shoot back before you can actually start shooting, and it gives them a further advantage over you when they go for this peak. That means that very often what you want to be doing is having your crosshair a little bit out from the corner. You can also try and hold it a little bit down from time to time, depending on the situation, to try and deal with a crouch peak if you think that's very likely in this certain situation. However, the reality is that you need to be able to recognize what your reactions are, because what you want is you want to hold it far enough out from the corner that as a player peeks into you, you are able to simply shoot. You don't have to adjust your crosshair because they go for the peek, their head is in your crosshair, and at the same time you see them, their head enters your crosshair and you shoot and they die, right? That is what you want to be doing, which means if you have fantastic reaction times, ridiculous reaction times, you can maybe hold it a little bit closer. However, the idea that they will overpeak the angle you're holding if you hold it too close is still very relevant and important to be able to recognize in these situations as well. Now, the final thing I'll mention about crosshair placement is something that's very relevant if you have an op. Now, something most oppers know about, but a lot of riflers don't know about, and especially if you pick up the op, is angle merging. And this is an idea where if someone peeks out on you, you don't want to be aiming so high that you have to aim down to shoot at a crouched peak, but you don't want to be aiming so low that a standing peeker will only be hitting the leg. And oftentimes that means moving from the angle you're holding or potentially crouching and aiming in the middle, where you'll hit someone that crouches in the head and you'll hit someone that shoulder peeks on you in the body. This is something that most people do somewhat intuitively, but I thought was important to be able to recognize as well. There are many different angles where you want to be trying to merge the way people could potentially peek on you, because when it comes to the op, the main thing you're trying to focus on is your reaction times, so that if an opper peeks out on you or someone tries to peek out and pre-fire the angle you're holding, as in shoot before they even see you, like pre-fire on the angle like that, you want to be able to react quickly enough to kill them. And if they go for a normal peek with a rifle or swing on you as they try and run around the corner, you're assuming that you're going to be able to find that kill regardless. So this is something that oppers often do, and you might question why riflers don't do it more. Well, that's because usually with a rifle, you need to hit someone in the head and not the body to secure a very quick kill. And if they swing around the corner, you don't kill them instantly, and they shoot back and hit you in the head, you're going to end up dying. So there are situations where you can aim low with the rifle, but those are few and far between for the most part. So of course, crosshair placement and movement are very important when it comes to your time to kill, how fast you can kill your opponents, but when it really comes down to pointing and clicking at people, sensitivity is one of the first things you're going to be wanting to think about. And I would highly recommend that the majority of players stick within a sensitivity range of somewhere around 400 DPI and 1.6 in-game sensitivity to 400 DPI and 2.5 in-game sensitivity. Now, the majority of professional players you'll see do sit around that area in general, perhaps a little bit on either side for some players, but you see very few professional players play outside of that range. Now, is it possible to have good aim and be outside of that range? Certainly, but if you haven't tried within this range, I highly recommend it. And if you're looking for a sensitivity to begin with, if you're a more beginner player, you definitely want to be thinking about this type of sensitivity range. And to find your sensitivity, I would highly recommend you start and move in 0.1 or 0.2 increments throughout that to feel where it gets most comfortable. And I've shot a few bullets in the wall here because one of the ways you can start to get a decent idea of your sensitivity and if it's comfortable or not is by tracking a dot on the wall as you move back and forth. So you can shoot a couple bullets into the wall and you can move back and forth trying to track them. Now, if your sensitivity is too high, you're going to find that oftentimes you're chopping around a little bit. You're not able to stay on target and you're not able to do it with consistency. Of course, this is going to depend on your distance from the target, because if you have a very low sensitivity and you're too close, you're going to be picking up your mouse a little bit too often. And if you're too far with the high sensitivity, it's going to be incredibly hard. But if you try and do it at a wall like this and you can vary your range a little bit, you can get a decent feel for how a sensitivity is before you actually do anything else. And you can make sure that it's nothing drastically too high or drastically too low for you to actually be able to handle. But I would recommend a little bit higher sensitivities if you have a smaller mouse pad. One of my requirements for comfortable aiming is the ability to relatively easily do a 180. If I go for a fast spin here from the middle of my very large mouse pad to the side, I can do exactly a 180 or just about exactly a 180. Now, this doesn't mean you have to be able to do exactly a 180 to be able to have good aim, because if you go to the lower end of the spectrum that I gave in terms of sensitivities, you're going to find that it is a little bit smaller than 180, or actually somewhat drastically smaller than 180, depending on how you define the things. But if you try and stay somewhere around 180, which on a fairly large mouse pad should be somewhere around 400 DPI and 1.8 sensitivity, you're going to have a much better time when it comes to matchmaking and pugs, especially because very often you can't have defined roles in these situations. And when you don't have defined roles, you oftentimes have people surprising you from angles you don't expect, and being able to turn and actually shoot back at them is a relevant factor, especially when you're thinking about clearing angles, which can sometimes get fairly close up. If your sensitivity is too low, you're going to have a pretty tough time of it, even at the lower end of the sensitivities I recommended. So you probably want to be staying somewhere within that range, but around the middle of that range is where I would highly recommend you at least attempt to try it. Everyone's going to have a different comfortable sensitivity. However, you can give a shot to sensitivities that are a little bit higher or lower than what you're used to. Now, you've probably found a couple sensitivities that are feeling pretty good for you, either higher or lower in the sensitivity range. And one thing you do need to think about when you're thinking about sensitivity is arm versus wrist movement. Of course, wrist movement usually lends itself to slightly higher sensitivities, a more flicky aim where you can shoot or flick a little bit more quickly and potentially a little bit more accurately. However, with arm aim, you're going to have a little bit more consistency, because if you're moving your forearm as it's stable and your wrist is locked in position, it means your crosshair is almost always going to be on head level, because there's no real ability for your arm without a drastic shift downwards or upwards to accidentally move off of head level. So you'll find that some players are more comfortable with more wrist aiming and some with more arm aiming, but from my experience, I've seen most of the players that I've played with stick to arm aiming a little bit more, and they find it to be a little bit more consistent. This is very much personal preference. I just wanted to mention that there is a difference between wrist and arm aiming, and if you're trying to use your wrist on the lower end of the sensitivity spectrum that I've outlined, you're probably going to feel like it's a little bit ridiculous, and the same goes in the other direction. If you're trying to use your arm to aim at the higher end of that sensitivity spectrum, you're probably also going to have a pretty tough time. Definitely, the arm versus wrist thing plays into what your sensitivity is going to be. Now, if you found a sensitivity that's feeling pretty comfortable for you, the one recommendation I have is to not only deathmatch or only aim map to try and iron it out. Go into a deathmatch or an aim map or a practice map to try and figure things out. However, you should realize that a deathmatch very heavily relies on you being able to catch players and flick to them with drastic differences in where they are versus where you're aiming because of the random spawns. However, with aim maps, the exact opposite is true. You know exactly where your opponents are spawning, you know exactly where they're coming from, and you're usually at a pretty decent distance. So if you aim map, you're going to end up with a fairly low sensitivity, and if you deathmatch, you're oftentimes going to end up with a very high sensitivity, where in reality, the actual game is somewhere in the middle for the most part. You will very often have opponents, and hopefully for the most part, that come out in front of you. However, sometimes you'll have opponents that are surprising you, or you'll need to entry frag with close range angles, or, and this is very relevant, you'll need to dodge a flash, and if your sensitivity is ridiculously low, it's going to be pretty tough for you to do any of those things. But of course, you need to be able to do the peek outs where you're able to deal with the players where you know exactly where they are pretty effectively as well. So you're going to have to find a balance between what would feel good in either of those as compared to what would feel good in a real game. So once you've got your sensitivity down, the next thing you're probably going to be looking at is your recoil control, because if you're shooting at an opponent and your bullets are going 10 feet in the air, of course you're going to be having a pretty bad time. What you want to be thinking about when you're looking at your recoil control is just keeping the bullets generally on your enemy. And what most people will do to try and practice is they'll head to a wall like this and they'll try and shoot 30 bullets and try and keep them in a reasonable spread. This is great to get your recoil down, and you want to try and make sure it's kept within a reasonable spread pattern. However, what oftentimes people overlook is the burst pattern, because they'll be able to spray when they're thinking about controlling their recoil against the spray, but then their actual bursts will end up looking like this. So you want to be able to combine your movement, recoil control, and crosshair placement together, where you can be moving and shooting like this. And if you're newer to the game, definitely would recommend this type of practice where you're aiming against the wall, strafing, stopping, and immediately shooting, and make sure that your first bullet isn't errantly moving in the wrong direction, because you're not quite yet stopped when you start shooting. So you want to be able to get 3 to 5 bullet bursts that end in a fairly tight, compact pattern, and then you feel pretty good about it. And if you want to work on your actual full spray recoil control, you can certainly spray against the wall. One of the things I would recommend is turning on, this is weapon underscore accuracy underscore no spread. And what this is going to do is, because each bullet in a spray pattern has a little bit of randomness where it exactly lands, even though the pattern itself is going to be the same every time or very similar, that means that sometimes if you don't have no spread on, you're going to have an inaccurate estimation of how good your recoil control is. Instead, if you turn no spread on, it's going to allow you to theoretically get your bullets landing in a dot if you had perfect recoil control. Of course, nobody's going to have perfect recoil control, but it does give you a better idea of how your bullets are landing and how you can try and work on that spray control. Now, if you want to practice your recoil control, the first map I'm going to show you here is Recoil Master. That's recoil underscore master. And this is a map where it's a little bit more beginner focused, but everyone can get something out of this map, where it shows you the exact spray pattern of the AK. And when you try and spray against the wall, there's a green dot that you can try and follow to try and get your recoil perfect and try and get it down, especially if you're not used to it at all. And if you change guns, it's going to give you the recoil control or the spray pattern of each gun that you change to up at the top, and it's going to give you a pretty good idea of what the spread pattern is. So if you're more beginner, this is a fantastic way to practice your recoil. However, personally, I find the green dot just distracts me. A map that I've found a little bit more personal enjoyment out of practicing my recoil and other things on is Training Aim CSGO 2. There might be an updated version of this out there somewhere as well, but this is the one that I currently have. And the way I practice this for recoil is I come to classic fast aiming. I change the color to white because it's a little bit easier for me to see. Shots to kill to 7, static target duration to infinite, and the delay to 0. And what this is going to do is this is going to give me one target, which is sitting still, and then I can shoot 7 times before it drops down. You can also increase the target size a little bit depending on how practiced you are and how big you want the target to be. But what this means is I can turn SV infinite ammo to 2, which means I'll have infinite ammo but have to reload every 30 bullets. And I can try and spray transfer to these targets every 7 bullets and, potentially kill as many as possible before I run out of bullets. And this is a great way to move your recoil control out of spraying against a wall, where you have immediate feedback as to where the bullets are going, and however subconsciously it is, you may be adjusting your recoil to compensate. Instead, you have these targets that are a little bit harder to see the actual feedback from, and you're getting very good practice on what is the hardest part of recoil control, which is when you have to transfer to a second target, because you have to realize exactly where in the pattern you are in the middle of the pattern, change it to another player, and oftentimes you're down and to the left, and it feels very awkward to do unless you've practiced it. So you can definitely practice some recoil control and target transfer against bots that are running around in a map if you make them, if you put on bot don't shoot 1, or I like to do it on this map as well to get a little bit of practice against some targets. Now, there are quite a few other ways you can use this map, and there's plenty of practice maps to look at, but this is one of my favorite practice maps for many other things than just recoil control. And one of the things that I like to do, or a lot of people like to do, is you can change the target to whatever size you want. the target amount to 100, delay to 0.25, and duration to 0.5. Of course, you can always adjust these things, but this is a very classic type of way to practice your aim and something I've seen many pros do a challenge of. How many targets can you get? Over 100 targets with these settings. And what this is going to do is this is going to train your flicking to be able to shoot, one bullet at a target before it disappears and see how effective you are at doing so. Of course, when you're a little bit less experienced, you're going to have a little bit of a harder time, but it's going to practice your flicks a little bit. Now, the way I personally prefer to use this map is I turn it to intensive fast aiming. I turn the respawn time to 0.3, although 0.3 is quite hard, even if you're a little bit experienced. And you can use this to practice your flicks as well. The difference is the targets aren't going to disappear until you shoot them. So it's going to give you a pretty good chance to practice this type of shooting as you're picking your next target, and this is a decent way to get some practice as well. Another great practice map, and probably the most popular practice map to be honest, is aim_bots with a Z. And that brings you to a map here with bots loaded up all the way around you in 360 degrees, and you can try and practice your aim against these bots as well. And this is a perfect way to try and practice against actual players instead of just targets on a wall, and that's why this map is so popular. Now, probably the most popular way to use this map is to block off 3 of the walls, and then you can block up the furthest target, the furthest distance here at the back by using these things on top. And you can try and kill bots that are located in a pretty small area instead of having to turn 360 degrees. Now, there's a ton of different settings you can use here. You can add boxes, so you can only shoot them in the head, for example. You can add all sorts of things, but this is probably the most popular way to use it, and people often like to use a time trial. So it gives you a time limit it gives you a timer to see how fast you can kill 100 bots. And when you actually think about it, even compared to deathmatching, this is the best way to get practice on actual targets in the quickest time possible. Of course, the difference is these bots aren't moving, and if you make them move with these commands over here, they're not going to really move like humans. So it's not the same as practicing in a deathmatch. However, it is a good way to get some good flick practice or any type of different practice, depending on what you're looking at, in a short period of time, because you can kill 1,000 bots in here before you could even kill a couple hundred players in a deathmatch or aim map. Now, moving out of practice maps to something more significantly important in actual games is mentality. And mentality, I think, is where most players end up getting caught up, because you'll find that the majority of professional players in Counter-Strike are actually very good at a lot of different things because they have the right mentality to improve. They have the right mentality to learn. Of course, there may be genetic factors as well, but I think mentality is a major portion of what goes into it. And having the right mentality means that you're actually learning as you're playing the game. I find that most players that are kind of hard stuck in a certain rank and have spent hundreds or thousands of hours without improving are players that have trouble with conceptualizing how they should be improving within the game. I see people that very often will play out a round and not really think about the outcome of the round, or they'll play out the round, find out the outcome, and all they will say to themselves is, what did I do wrong? Well, I shouldn't have gone for this peak. Optimally, what you want to be doing to try and improve as quickly as possible is finding out what you did wrong and visualize what you could have done better. So I shouldn't have gone for this peak. Next time I will go for this separate peak. And best yet, you can try and visualize what you would have done better and try and get to the underlying concept. So if you went for a bad peak, next time you want to go for a different peak, and you can try and extrapolate that to be relevant in as many situations as possible. So maybe you think to yourself that when someone's holding a certain type of angle, for example, an angle like this, a 90 or 180 degree angle, I want to be crouch peeking on them. And that way you have your practice be as effective as possible, because not only are you learning from the exact scenarios you're in, you're also bringing this into different situations quickly and again, very effectively. And if you want your improvement to be as quick as possible, that's what you should be looking at. Now, if you have trouble doing this in the middle of a game, you can also go into your demos and try and do that as well. I think demos are great for, you can often watch your own perspective, look at the way things played out, and see what went wrong, and really look at what you could have done better. Now, the one thing I'll caution against, though, is results-oriented thinking, because in CS as a game, a lot of the time you're playing based on expected value. And that means you're not really ever going to have 100%, 0% situations when dealing with opponents or other players or teammates as well, because the best you can do is put yourself in a situation where you should succeed. And that means you might have 80-20 situations, you might have 70-30 situations, you might have 60-40 situations. And sometimes it could have been better, but other times you can be in a 90-10 situation and your opponent pulls off the play that should only happen in 10% of cases. You need to be able to disconnect yourself from that type of play and disconnect yourself a little bit from the result of what actually happened, and try and look at it objectively to see if it was the correct play regardless of outcome. And sometimes that means you'll have a play that works out for you that will actually be a poor play. And this is what people have trouble recognizing. Oftentimes people can recognize the situations where they played it well, but their opponent killed them anyways. You also have to recognize the situations where you played it poorly and your opponent died anyways. So you have to be able to recognize both when you're thinking about non-results oriented thinking, but it's definitely something that you should be considering whenever you're trying to practice and in many different situations. And the other thing you have to think about mentality is recognize that the goal is to improve. The goal isn't to win this specific game you're in. The goal is to, whatever your goal is to become a global elite, which is probably several ranks away for the majority of players, or it's to become a professional player, and that's way down the line for most of you, right? That's way down the line. That's potentially months or years away if it ever happens, which means this game you're actually in currently is somewhat irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. That means that oftentimes you want to allow yourself to not get too angry at your teammates or opponents if mistakes are made, because all it matters is that you're able to practice and improve effectively in your own way. So if your teammates are bombing the game and they're just getting destroyed, as long as you can do your own thing and they aren't actively griefing you, it shouldn't matter all that much. And if you don't get too angry where you won't be able to continue to improve, you're going to have a much better time at the game. And this does extrapolate into a lot of different situations where you want to consider taking the risk to try and test your limits in many different scenarios. That means if you don't know if something is going to work, if the stakes aren't all that high, you should definitely consider testing it and finding out for next time, so that next time you're in that situation, you have a better idea of what works and what doesn't. Should you go for this peak? I don't know. Well, if you don't know, you should definitely consider doing it if it doesn't matter all that much. Of course, one of the very important aspects of mentality is game sense, and I've tried to give you decent tips on game sense in terms of visualizing what you can do better, but a lot of the time game sense is something that you just have to grind out in the actual game and practice that will improve over time. But one aspect of game sense that can definitely improve from out of game practice is your utility usage. And utility usage is something that I see oftentimes people have a very tough time with, especially I often see it said that someone made a huge mistake dying with utility, and the answer is to pull out your utility and toss it down right before you die. I think this is a terrible mentality, and especially at lower ranks, this is something people get into their mind, where you recognize that you die very often with utility, so you'll be trapped in an area and you'll just want to toss your utility down frivolously. While in reality, your utility is better used when you have an actual reason to use it, and oftentimes I see people pull out utility when they would be much better served by keeping their guns out. You want to make sure that you are using your utility whenever possible, and if you die with full utility, you've likely made a mistake, but that doesn't mean the solution is to toss down your utility just as you're about to die. It means that earlier on in the round, potentially, you should have been using your utility to reposition, to get into an angle earlier, to give you space, things like this, where utility is actually important. The main recommendation I have is just to make sure that every piece of utility you use has some sort of purpose. A flash allowed a teammate to reposition, it gave space to your teammates, it allowed you to peek an angle, a Molotov allowed you to get into a more aggressive position, or potentially a Molotov cut off and execute. And that's one of the best ways to use a Molotov, is if you're getting pressured from short and long A here, instead of trying to focus on both, you can toss, for example, a molly out towards short and then only have to focus on long for 15 seconds. So you want to just make sure that every piece of utility has a real purpose behind it and it's not just thrown out and wasted. An important thing also to think about is positioning. Usually newer players have a tendency to think that once you get to an angle, you're just trying to fight your opponents and then push up. However, you want to be taking the correct line into a bomb site or into an area to have the best chances of not getting taken down. And what does that mean? Well, that means if you're coming out an area like long here, which I think is a great example, you don't want to be running straight at the corner here, because that leaves you in the middle of the open where you can be peeked from the corner or you can be killed from pit very easily. And if a flash comes out, you're nowhere near cover. Usually, you want to be hugging a wall. That is generally the best tendency to hold on to if you're not sure of what to do. However, there's generally a couple of lines into an area or a bomb site that support each other. There's the more aggressive one and the more passive one. For the most part, there's usually two, maybe three. Out at long here, there's kind of two main ones. The first one would be to have a player come out along this back wall, strafe along it, so you're isolating yourself from the left side peak and making sure that if someone flashes and peeks there, you have cover you can get to, while holding towards pit. And the more aggressive angle, which is going to have less cover from flashes but try and be more aggressive and catch opponents off guard, is the angle that might come along the right side here and try and catch players as they fall back from this angle here. If you're watching a pro game, you'll very often see these two lines utilized along with maybe a passive, very supportive player holding this angle here. That's something you'll very often see. You may also see a player try and get out to the blue bin here and come along this wall, and this is a hyper aggressive line because you are in the middle of the open for a little while, and then you get along this wall to try and take a player down in pit. Now, you might not always see this type of thing because there's oftentimes a smoke down here blocking off the corner, so things might vary a little bit differently. But if there's no smoke, you'll oftentimes see these two lines. It's the aggressive line pushing up, trying to catch opponents off guard where you oftentimes don't have much cover, and the passive line that's supporting the angle the aggressive line may or may not be looking at any given time. The same thing holds true in the majority of different locations you can go to. If we continue up towards the A bomb site, it continues up into the middle here as well. You want to be either hugging the left wall, the more aggressive of the two options, or the right wall, which is the more supportive of the two options. The reasoning for this is that you don't want to be heading down the middle, again, because you're open to a variety of different angles for no real reason. If you want it to be open to the angles on the left and towards plat, you would want it to be as far away from those angles as possible to give yourself the best advantage geometrically and, in all sorts of other ways. And if you want it to be more aggressive, you want it to take the shortest route, which is exposed to the least angles, which is along the left wall here. The smoke will be down when you cross, hopefully, and you try and get across and get aggressive, either running up here or jumping up onto the box and jumping onto the platform, while you are somewhat supported by the player coming along the right wall, holding these angles, making sure nobody can go aggressive and peek out on you. You can see the difference between these two styles. What you don't want to be doing, for the most part, is running down the middle of an area open to everything, or oftentimes you want to try and avoid switching the routes you're going. That means if you get up to here and then start backing up to get along the back wall, you're running through no man's land to a certain extent, and you're kind of putting yourself in a very awkward and odd situation. You can sometimes do it, however, oftentimes you want to pick a line as you make your way into the bomb site and stick to it and recognize what that means and what it does for the way you're playing. Now, defensive lines are a little bit different. Well, they're not really called lines. I'll just call it positioning. And one of the things that I like to mention is that you generally don't want to ever be holding an angle where someone will peek out on you expecting you to be there. And that means their crosshair will be on your head before they're peeking out. It'll just stop and they'll be aiming right at you. You really generally don't want to be in those situations unless you have an op at a long range, like a corner over here, where it doesn't really matter that they expect you. You should still be able to kill them. Or if you have a massive advantage at that angle, for example, Pit is a decent example of this, because they know generally where you're going to be playing. However, your head could be at a couple of different locations, and because you're far enough away and only your head is showing, it's not the worst situation. However, a decent example of a bad angle to play would be on platform here holding this, because I think I've shown about 50 gazillion times now peeking out looking directly at the head of the player playing there. Now, you might be confused because this is a common spot for people to play. People often like to play on plat. How do you play here? Well, generally, you either want to be doing one of two things. You are strafing, checking the spot, and then unpeeking, something like this, where you can be holding this, waiting, and then peek out, or you can just be waiting and then peek out every second or two to try and catch a player off guard, where what you're hoping is that they peek your angle, clear it, and then look at the next angle, and then you peek out and shoot at them. Or in this specific spot, you can be crouch uncrouching, where you're sitting here, uncrouch, and then crouch again, which is a great way to play this spot specifically. Or you can be holding an off angle. That means you're still near cover here. You're not in an off angle that's completely one and done. However, you're making sure that as you see the player, they're very unlikely to be looking at you, because if a player comes out to here, are they really staring at the box? Well, sometimes they might be if they have some intuition, but very often they're going to be staring over here, and you get yourself an advantage to try to kill them. Now, of course, this spot is mollied out, but the idea still holds true that this is a good way to try and catch your opponents off guard. If you are sitting in the angle where they expect you and they peek out looking right at you, you're giving them a very good chance to kill you instantly and just completely dominate you. And it's going to seem like their aim is absolutely insane, when in reality, all they did was pre-aim their crosshair, stop, your head's right there, and they didn't even have to adjust their crosshair at all, for the most part, to get the free kill on you. You need to be trying to avoid this type of situation. Now, another concept to think about is angle isolation, and that's the idea that you want to be open to as few angles as possible whenever possible. You want to be only fighting against one angle an opponent can be at whenever you can help it. And a good example of a spot that is not isolated at all is the very common op spot here in middle. It is open to a lower B-tons peak, a Xbox peak, and a top middle peak, and theoretically, if someone was already up cat, a cat peak as well. This means it's open to 4 angles, and it's very disadvantageous to be holding. Now, why do people hold it? Well, they hold it because usually you're peaking this early on in the round before these other angles are relevant, and you're only worried about one spot. However, it is very open. It is the opposite of an isolated angle. Another decent example of a very unisolated situation is peeking in window. You're peeking out into multiple angles at the same time, and there's very little you can do to help it, except if you try and isolate yourself from the other angles and hold the players as they come over the box or something like this. This is oftentimes played because of how unisolated this situation is. Good ways to isolate yourself from angles are to stay near walls, especially because the walls will oftentimes isolate you from one side. For example, if you come over to middle here and you try and come out, if you walk down the middle, you're kind of in the open for both sides. However, if you hold the left angle, you're very isolated from this player here who has to swing very wide to actually see you. But you're very open to this player on the other side. So you're intentionally trying to kill the player's CT spawn side, and in doing so, you are isolating yourself from the player on the B side. And the same thing is true on the opposite angle. You are isolating yourself from the CT player and trying to take on the single angle against these players or player that is on this B ramp side of the map. You're isolating yourself as much as possible. And this can be very specifically relevant when you're trying to hold on in certain clutch situations or in certain outnumbered situations. And a decent example would be if you're stuck behind the box here, or actually you can try and be stuck behind this box here, and they're trying to retake B as you're on T side, 2 or 3v1. Instead of coming out here to peek out to the window, which would be absolutely ridiculous, but you can imagine it. You peek out here to peek the window where you're isolated from the door, and then oftentimes you'll crouch down to try and peek out door. Like this, right? So you isolate yourself from the window angle so that you can peek the door angle. Or you peek on the other side of the box. You isolate yourself from the window angle so you can peek the door angle. And if you're worried about tunnels, usually you isolate yourself from both and look at tunnels. So you can see the idea here is that you're not opening yourself up to one as much as possible. And if you are, you close that out when you try and clear the other one. And you can sometimes be even trapped in situations where this angle isolation can become very fluid, where you might be in a situation that someone's pushing through the doors here, swinging on your wide right, trying to catch you off guard, and there's a player in window. If you're trying to fight the player in window, occasionally it helps you to move forward while fighting this player, to isolate yourself from the player on the right here as you continue fighting the player in window. You can see how this type of thing extrapolates, where you're constantly trying to make sure there is an object between you and any potential threat, except for the one you're trying to actually currently deal with. Now, the next thing to think about is how you actually want to be defending a bomb site, because there's a big difference between solo holding a bomb site and holding a bomb site with multiple players there. A decent example is B here on Dust 2. In fact, it's one of the most relevant examples because B is incredibly hard to retake if your opponents get control of it, especially if they get control of B with a ton of utility left. If they get control of B and have very little utility and the numbers are very low, sometimes it can be a little bit better. The idea is that you don't want to be dying. In fact, more than you want to be finding frags, you want to be surviving when you're solo holding a bomb site. And the reasoning behind that is you want to allow time and space for your teammates to rotate over and support you. And if you die, you want to allow time and space for your teammates to retake the bomb site without the bomb having been planted. A decent example of what you don't want to do is playing close on tunnels, getting one kill, and instantly dying. The reason you don't want to do this is because by the time you get information as to where they are, they're already just about in the bomb site, and there's really nothing your rotate can do to stop it. Now, maybe it's different if your rotate is very close, like he's playing window looking at middle. However, if your rotate is very far away playing CT, your priority over everything else is to survive, because if you die and they're already this close up, the bomb will be planted before your teammates even get anywhere near B, and your opponents can use very little utility to prevent the early kind of pressure from the rotate coming through. They use very little utility taking the bomb site, and all they have is utility held onto for the after plant, and your teammates might even try and save in situations where they potentially could be going for it, like a 4v4 or a 3v3. They might even consider saving. What you want to be doing very often, in fact most of the time if you're solo holding a bomb site, is preferably you get a kill and stay alive. That means you find a kill, or you play an angle where you can get an entry, catching the initial player off guard, and then back up to safety. And when you back up to safety, you can oftentimes either use some utility yourself to try and play around with these players, or you'll get a teammate that will throw some utility for you. For example, tossing a flash off of a wall like that, throwing it in front of the box here, or tossing it over in some other way to try and support you. And then when you are pressured heavily enough and you know that you will die, that's when you end up trying to frag out, especially with that extra support from a rotator pressuring in. And the rotator pressuring in can in fact create space for you as well, because if someone tosses a flash, obviously you've got a little bit of space to work with, but also if your opponents now, because they've taken 5 or 10 seconds to kill you, have to post up on door or window, that means one of their players is potentially taken out of an angle where he would otherwise be aiming at you. So your goal there is to survive as long as possible and hopefully get a couple of kills. A solid B site defense here on Dust 2 would be 2 kills and a little bit of time delayed for a rotate to come over. That would be a successful hold. 1 kill and instantly dying would not be good, but it wouldn't be the end of the world as long as a rotate was close. But that is an example of something you don't want to be doing. right? As much as possible. Even not getting a kill, but surviving is generally very oftentimes going to be better than getting one kill and instantly dying without surviving for any period of time. Now, if you're on a bomb site held by multiple people, of course surviving is relevant as well, but the rotations are going to be further away, and they're probably going to be quite a bit slower because your solo bomb site player very likely isn't going to rotate until the bomb is called or a full commit is called, and these are situations where you're oftentimes trying to frag out. If your opponents are coming up catwalk and you have a player pit, a player near car, game helper, whatever you want to call it, and a player goose or ramp, generally you're just trying to frag out. You're really not thinking about delaying for time, although getting frags is of course a great way to delay for time. Your goal is to find as many frags as possible, and if you die, so be it. Naturally, it's better to get 2 frags and stay alive than 2 frags and die, but you can see the difference. If you get 2 frags and your teammates get 2 frags each, well, that's 6 kills. That's more kills than are in the server. It doesn't really matter how set up your team is for the retake. On the other hand, at B, if you get 2 kills and you die immediately, although you have put your team in a man advantage, you haven't really set up your teammates for the retake, and there could be issues. Now, of course, getting 2 kills and dying is generally considered fine, but I'm just trying to show no matter how many kills you get, unless you ace them, a retake will have to come through eventually if you are a solo bomb site player. Now, when it comes to the next aspect of mentality, it's going to be communication. This is something that's very different for different people and in different situations, but it's very often and very common that I see people that either communicate far too much information or far too little information, and it's hard to isolate both of these cases, but you want to be making sure that you're communicating information that is relevant to your team. And a good example is if you're over here towards B on a default. So we can imagine there's 2 players towards lower or catwalk. There's a player outside long and a player in T-spawn. Does it matter that your opponent at B has thrown down a Molotov, a smoke, and a flash? Well, it doesn't matter to say to your team, he Molotov'd, he smoked, and he flashed. It doesn't matter to say that when he does it. However, it does matter that if you have a strat caller, for example, your strat caller knows that the B player is out of utility. That is very important information, and if you don't have a strat caller, you can say it later in the round, say the B player is fully out of utility, or you can say it right then, the B player is out of utility, maybe we should make our way back over to B. This is a great form of communication. However, you need to realize that just calling out what your opponent is doing and calling out what you're doing when what you're doing doesn't really have any impact on what is going on throughout the map probably isn't all that important. Do you need to call out that you're holding this angle here? Well, if you've got 4 other players in tunnels, then maybe it is important to call out what angle you're holding. And if you've got 4 players in tunnels and 2 of them are sitting in lower, waiting for a mid push and waiting for you guys to call to go out into B, then maybe calling we're waiting out the smoke is an important piece of information, but you need to make sure that you're only calling out the information that is relevant to the players around you and not ultra frivolous. Now, going for a pick, even if your teammates aren't around you, is something important because it relays information that perhaps your opponent or your teammates should play a certain way to try and help you deal with going for that pick and things like that. Now, one of the best ways to use communication is to suggest something for someone when you use your utility. So instead of saying, I'm in lower tons and I've got nades, you say, I'm flashing for you on cat, something like that. Now, it can be very hard to recommend this type of thing to teammates that you don't really actively know, and it can often be very hard in situations where you're not 100% sure on what you should be. Effective ways to use your nades that I see people have trouble with very often. Instead of using a nade and suggesting it to a teammate, they'll always wait for a teammate to ask for a nade. So a teammate will get to this corner here and say, can you flash me up, cat? Well, if you're able to look at your mini map and you're able to see that a player is getting close to an angle where they need a nade, you can say, I'll flash you up cat, or do you want to flash up cat? And when you do that, you shorten the time that it takes for your teammate to ask for the utility, and you make your communication even more effective. Because again, if this guy gets here and has to ask, you might have to say no because you don't have a flash, and that throws a major wrench in things. Instead, if you're very active with your communication and looking at things that you can recommend or you can suggest, you're going to have a better time in terms of how fast he can do it. Because if he asks, it takes an extra couple seconds for you to throw that flash or pull it out and then throw it. Whereas if you had just recognized this earlier, you could do it yourself. But these are both effective ways to communicate, asking for the flash and suggesting the flash as well. You just don't want to be spamming your teammates with information that they don't need or isn't very important to them, because you want to keep the communication channels a little bit clear for when important things do pop up. Now, when it comes to picking maps to practice, this is something I feel pretty differently about than a lot of people seem to feel. In my opinion, almost every map in the map pool has something unique about it that is what makes it a strong map for certain teams. For example, Inferno, your utility usage is incredibly important. On Nuke, your rotations are incredibly important. And when you look at certain bunches of maps, for example, Dust 2, Mirage, Inferno, these are maps where defaults can find a ton of use and can get a lot done. Whereas if you look on a map like Vertigo or a map like Nuke, a straight up standard default is going to have a much tougher time. You need to be a little bit more reactive in the way you play. Now, of course, that's more relevant for teams themselves. However, it's still relevant when you look at pugs and matchmaking as well. If you play a map like Dust 2, it's got a completely different layout and it requires quick rotations and, a good idea of the way your opponents are rotating and quick reactions on how you can react to that, as compared to a map like Inferno, where again, things are a little bit slower and it's a lot more about utility usage. So when I talk to players about what maps they play, a lot of people have a tendency to play mostly Dust 2, Mirage, and Inferno, or Cache when it's in the map pool, because these are the easier, puggier maps to play that don't rely, like Nuke, on very crisp rotations. However, if you are trying to play the game, competitively at least, I would highly recommend trying to expand your map pool as much as possible to work on the things that make you bad at other maps. And of course, there are maps that maybe just aren't fun to you and you don't want to play, but you can try and recognize if the reason you don't want to play it is because your communication's really weak, your rotations are really weak, your utility usage is really weak, or if it's because the map layout actually is something you simply don't enjoy. If you're new to the game, I'd recommend picking up a specific map, starting with it, and adding maps in one by one, and not ever becoming a full-on, one map hero like CS Office, Global Elite, stuff like that. I'd recommend trying to vary your map pool so you can actually balance the things you're good at. Now, the other idea to think about is how you should be playing in terms of your playstyle. Are you an aggressive player? Are you a passive player? Are you a support or an entry? Now, for the most part, it's very often people are an entry player until the point where they get to a spot where they're not good enough, and then they're a support player. I'd recommend against that type of mentality. That puts you in a situation where you're playing against your strengths. In reality, what's going to happen is by playing for long enough, you're going to start to notice that you as a person have specific tendencies. You like to take the aggressive peaks. You like to rotate around very often. For me, I'm pretty ADD, which means I like to constantly be aggressive. I like to be at a different angle very often. So what do? I op, and I oftentimes rotate around the map looking for entries rather than playing one angle all the time. You're going to notice that your playstyle does eventually just come to you, and that's the playstyle that you're probably going to have for the majority of the time you play the game, and there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes it might feel like your playstyle is a negative to you. However, you should realize that while you want to try and cover up your weaknesses and work on what you're weak at as much as possible, you should also be able to recognize that if you try to utilize too heavily into becoming a support player, for example, when you are naturally very aggressive, oftentimes what that's going to do is it's going to take the things that you're good at and make you kind of weak at them. It's going to make you a worse player. So when you're looking at your playstyle, you can certainly be a support player. However, make sure that's something you want to be and not something you're just kind of pigeonholed into being when it's not the way you want to play, but it's just what you think is right to play. Play the playstyle that comes to you and try and work your way around it. For example, Draken with the 30-degree window, he plays around that because he knows that that's his strength. The ridiculous flicks are his strength, so what does he do? He goes for the ridiculous flicks as much as possible. Now, this isn't to say that every ridiculous thing you do is good because that's your playstyle, but definitely make sure that you're working towards your strengths and not away from them when you're trying to practice and improve. Just because Astralis plays a certain way doesn't mean you need to play that exact way as well. Now, when it comes to practicing, a lot of people I've noticed have a tendency to have this thing where they think they have bad aim, so what they do to fix it is deathmatch 5 hours a day and then play one pug or matchmaking game and say, well, I practiced my aim today. Well, it's great to be practicing your aim, but in reality, something like deathmatching, as I've already tried to establish, is something where it works mostly on your point-click aim and things like recoil control over the things that actually affect your time to kill or what feels like your aim in a real game. And I would highly recommend sticking or staying away from any ridiculous practice patterns where you are out of the actual competitive game more than you're in it. For the most part, I would recommend never going over something like 30% deathmatching, if that even, when you're trying to practice the game. And if you're playing with a team, you probably can start to factor a little bit more heavily into other things because you might be looking at team demos, you might be going over strats and things like that. But when you're sitting in a matchmaking team where you're just playing random games as a solo, you probably don't want to be doing too much of anything other than actually playing the game and occasionally reviewing a demo. Now, do you want to be reviewing your own demos? I've recommended earlier that if you have trouble finding out your mistakes in the game, you can try to review your own demos. Just make sure you try and stay away from too heavily results-oriented thinking, where you're looking at what your opponent actually did rather than what your opponent could have done, and trying to think of a way you can play this next time that potentially could have been worse than the way you played it because you're only trying to counter what your opponent exactly did. One of the things you can use your own demos for is to check the way you look to your opponents. For example, look at the ways your nades affected your opponents or your flashes affected your opponents. Maybe a flash was weak and you didn't even realize it, and you can look at your opponents to see how it actually affected them. One of the ways that I've had a very good time reviewing my own demos is actually seeing how my peaks were on opponents. I found a few times that I've thought a peak was very effective against an enemy, gone into a demo, and thought they hit a ridiculous shot on me, only to find that they actually hit a very easy shot because the peak I was going for was incredibly ineffective, and they found plenty of time to find the frag. This is the type of thing that you can often find when you're looking at your own demos, over top of things you can try and work on and trying to optimize the way you actually play from your own perspective. One of the other things about demos that I'll mention is I think pro demos are one of the most overrated things that people look at. I've seen many times where someone says, I'm a silver player and I'm looking for the best demo to help me learn how to play long A on Dust 2, and they'll send a bunch of pro demos over. Now, of course, you're not going to be sending amateur demos over. However, I think that watching pro demos is something that is easy to fall into traps with, because you get into situations where pros have a lot of different things that they know. Now, I'll give a few examples. First off, if you're looking at a certain pro, for example, Zeus, is he questioning whether he can aim better than the rest of the players in the game if he's playing against Liquid? Well, probably not. He knows his position in that game relative to his opponents, and the majority of players in the game know that as well. So oftentimes things will look a little bit weird because of that type of information and because of counter-stratting. And counter-stratting is something that I very rarely see brought up, however, is very relevant when you're looking at professional teams. Of course, not everything is counter-stratted. However, There are many times where a team will know that a certain player likes to go to a certain angle at a certain time, so they throw nades at that time, or a certain player likes to play this spot, a certain player likes to do a certain type of play, or a team likes to do a certain type of strategy. And they will adjust their play, not entirely, but at least partially, to try and deal with that sort of play and try and deal with the specific opponents they're playing. For example, if you're playing against Furia, which is a team that likes to do a lot of, pop out with 5 players behind a flash, catch you off guard, heavy aggression, you're playing the same when you're playing against a team like Astralis. And that type of nuance is often lost if you are a lower level player watching a professional demo, and that's why I often caution against watching it too heavily. You certainly can watch a demo, and if you put in the time, you can get an idea of the way a player very often plays a spot if you watch a few different maps. However, if you don't know what you're looking at, you can very often get kind of caught out and start to do things that aren't exactly optimal because there's a reason the player was doing that. And oftentimes this doesn't even necessarily relate to them counter-stratting. It can relate to the player you're watching playing with a team who knows how to react to what's going on. They might be throwing a flash that you don't notice. They might be throwing nades that you don't see. They might be doing a specific type of rotation to throw their opponents off. They could be doing all sorts of things. And again, if you don't know what you're looking at, you might fall into a trap. So what do I recommend? Well, I certainly do recommend watching pro demos, but I don't recommend trying to steal their entire playstyle. Steal an angle that they play and practice it and find out if that angle works for you in a real game. Steal a nade that they throw and try and find a way to bring that into a game of your own as well. Don't try and copy their entire playstyle and do that, especially don't try and copy their playstyle after watching one demo against one team and think that this is an optimal way to play. Oftentimes there are going to be some errors that you're not realizing. Try and find your own way to play, but pick up things from other players along the way. Now, the next few things are going to be a little bit more outside of the exact game. It's going to be more about teams and platforms you can play on. So when is it good to find a team? I have a kind of weird recommendation on this because I don't think it's ever bad to be on a team. However, your priorities should be different when you're at different levels. If you're in something like Gold Nova, or if you're in Silver, you're mostly trying to work on your fundamentals. You're trying to work on things that a team won't necessarily help all that much with. So I wouldn't recommend looking for a team. However, if you end up on a team, that can be incredibly positive because you can have a group of players that are working with the same goal. When you get to a lower level, if you're trying to play on a team, my recommendation is to look less at skill level and more at mentality. Make sure all 5 players on the team are players that are playing the same hours or similar hours with the same goals, because you will be improving hopefully fairly quickly, and you don't want to have a player on your team that becomes dead weight because he only plays occasionally, he only plays certain hours, or he has different goals in what he looks at and tries to improve in the game. As you get to higher and higher ranks and you go onto platforms like Faceit and ESEA to play in leagues, that's when you're looking at more of their skill level, because the improvement slows down at that point, and you're looking at trying to win and improve as a team, which is less about improving as an individual in leaps and bounds than you might be if you're a team filled with silvers. And when you're on a team like that, again, you can be prioritizing the skill of your teammates, but also it's never a bad idea to look at mentality as well and make sure that your open team, if you're on one, has similar goals as well, so you can improve together and maybe you can stick together for quite a while. Now, the question is, when should you be starting on these platforms? If you're looking for a team, I'd say you want to start looking when you're on one of these platforms and at a decent rank on it, perhaps rank C or C plus on ESEA, or rank 5 or more on Faceit. I'm not sure exactly how they compare. Which one should you be playing on? Well, on North America, currently, ESEA is still the more dominant of the platforms, and on Europe, I believe Faceit is the more dominant platform as well. And while you may watch this video at a later date, maybe potentially years in the future, you're going to have to do the research for yourself, but at the current moment, I would recommend ESEA if you're in North America, Faceit if you're in Europe, and start playing once you get the fundamentals down. That means start playing around MGE or that area where your fundamentals may not be perfect, however, you're not moving around the map looking at the ground. When you're at that point, it doesn't really matter if you're playing a client or not. All that matters is that you are practicing the game and trying to work on these fundamentals, and it's not going to matter if you're playing a cheater once in a while, because again, it doesn't matter if a cheater's in the game if you're aiming at the ground. That's not really going to make much of a difference, is it? It doesn't, right? Now, once you're on a platform and you're playing, you might be starting to think to yourself, do your stats matter? And do your league stats matter? And unfortunately, although everyone loves it if I say no, I have to say that to a certain extent, your stats will always matter when you're looking to try and improve, when you're looking to try and find a team, when you're looking to try and find players to play with, because the reality is, although your stats could be worse than the reality of your skill level, for example, a player who plays Bombsite anchor and ends up doing a very good job at Bombsite anchoring might have much lower ADR, which is damage per round, than a player who plays a rotator role or an entry role where they oftentimes see players. Unfortunately, these stats do actually make a difference. You can only have, like, as someone that's tried out random players before, you can only stomach playing with so many players who insist that they are much better than their stats indicate and are definitely not much better than their stats indicate before you give up on the concept entirely. So if your stats are really bad and you're trying to find a team, a random team from the forums or from a looking for team post, you are going to be judged at least partially based on your stats, and that's an unfortunate reality. If you want to try and work past that and show teams that you are a good player, even if your stats don't show it because you're a site anchor or something like that, I would recommend trying to network as much as possible. And the reality is that CS is very heavily about your ability to network with other players. That means find players that you're friends with and think you are a good player so that when their team is looking for someone, when they need a fifth, they contact you even if your stats are bad. And a lot of people, or honestly, probably the majority of people that get on very good teams oftentimes do so because of their networking, because they found players of a good skill level in pugs especially, or in 10-mans, which are organized with usually a group of players that play together very often, which I've been a part of many of, but you can find them in pugs as well, where you become friendly with the players, there's someone on your friends list, they think you're good, and when a chance opens up, they give it to you and they let you get a potentially higher ranked team regardless of the stats that you're actually showing. So do your stats matter? Well, kind of. Hopefully you're in a situation where your stats don't matter, but in reality, if you're ever looking for a random team and you're making a looking for team post, your stats are going to make a difference. So at the end of the day, that's all I've got in terms of improving at CS. I might have missed one or two things, and I didn't mention exactly everything because I'm looking at improving, not specifically mentioning every tiny thing, but that's what I've got for you here. If you enjoyed the content, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you can see every time I make a video. And if you really, really like the content, feel free to support me on Patreon or Twitch, and you can get more of this type of content. So thanks for watching, and I hope this helped.